Firebase Kate. When 176 Americans held against 6,000 North Vietnamese in the autumn of 1969, a young captain named William Albra arrived at one of the most dangerous assignments in Vietnam. He was only 21 years old, yet he'd been chosen to command Firebase Kate, a remote outpost buried deep in the Central Highlands, just miles from the Cambodian border. The base perched on a hilltop, completely surrounded by dense jungle, far from any significant support. It wasn't the posting most officers wanted, but when Albra's orders came through, he didn't question them. As the youngest Green Beret commander in the entire war, he understood what was expected of him. This was 1969, a time when experienced officers were scarce and the fighting showed no sign of ending. Albra had trained extensively and earned his position through merit, but nothing truly prepares a soldier for a place like Firebase Kate. Remote, exposed, perpetually vulnerable. The men stationed there understood they were largely on their own. That was simply the reality of life in the Highlands. The firebase itself was modest, almost primitive. A handful of bunkers, walls built from sandbags, and a crude command post sitting on a ridgeline. Beyond it stretched an endless expanse of thick jungle capable of concealing anything. The nearest friendly units were hours away on foot, and air support depended entirely on weather conditions and aircraft availability. This was the kind of place where split-second decisions mattered, where mistakes couldn't be undone. Albra grasped this truth the moment his boots hit the ground. His mission was to lead a diverse force. American soldiers working alongside local Montagnard fighters who possessed an intimate knowledge of the terrain. The Montagnards were indigenous Highlanders who'd been fighting with U.S. forces for years. Tough, loyal, absolutely essential for maintaining control in such treacherous territory. Albra respected them immediately, recognizing that earning their trust would prove just as vital as any tactical strategy he could devise. Initially, Firebase Kate seemed peaceful enough. The days stretched long and hot, filled with routine patrols and radio checks. Occasionally, there were signs of enemy movement in the distance, but nothing that indicated immediate threat. Still, Albra couldn't dismiss a growing sense that something was building out there in the green darkness. Intelligence reports mentioned North Vietnamese activity in the area, though the information remained frustratingly vague. He made certain his men stayed alert and combat ready. What Albra didn't yet realize was just how close the enemy had come. In the hills surrounding Firebase Kate, thousands of North Vietnamese soldiers were methodically preparing for something far more significant than a minor engagement. They'd been observing the outpost for weeks, carefully studying its defenses, patiently waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The base was small enough that everyone knew each other's names, habits, stories. There were no comforts, only essentials: water, rations, ammunition, and whatever mail occasionally reached them from the world beyond. Showers were rare luxuries, sleep was always light, and the heat was relentless. Despite everything, the men found ways to cope. Card games, storytelling, quiet conversations after dark. Albra made it a point to move among them regularly, checking in, listening, ensuring that morale didn't crumble under the crushing weight of isolation. That kind of visible leadership mattered more than most people realized. What distinguished Firebase Kate from countless other outposts was its strategic location. It sat squarely in what military planners designated a critical corridor, a stretch of jungle the North Vietnamese routinely used to transport troops and supplies southward. That meant Kate wasn't just another mark on a map. It was simultaneously an observation post, an early warning system, and a target. Albra and his men were positioned there to observe, report, and when possible, disrupt enemy movements. But operating that close to hostile territory meant constant exposure to danger. By mid-October, the Firebase had settled into an uneasy routine. Patrols departed and returned. Radio checks arrived on schedule. Occasional skirmishes flared and faded, brief firefights that erupted and died just as quickly. Nothing suggested the massive storm gathering in the hills around them. For the moment, life at Firebase Kate was tense, uncomfortable, exhausting, but manageable. That fragile stability wouldn't last much longer. By mid-October, intelligence reports began flowing into Firebase Kate with increasing frequency and urgency. Radio intercepts detected unusual movement in the surrounding hills, and reconnaissance patrols discovered fresh trails cutting through the jungle. Initially, it appeared to be standard activity, small groups moving supplies or shifting positions. But the patterns felt different this time. The volume, the coordination, something about it didn't match previous enemy behavior. Albra studied the reports carefully, attempting to piece together what was happening beyond their perimeter, hidden in the darkness past their wire. As days passed, the jungle surrounding Firebase Kate grew unnaturally quiet. Birds stopped calling. Even the insects seemed subdued. The Montagnards noticed it first, that eerie stillness that precedes something terrible. Albra walked the perimeter, at dusk, scanning the tree line, pressing in from every direction. Out there, concealed in the green shadows, an enemy force was moving into position. They simply didn't know how many. And by the time they discovered the truth, it would already be too late to summon help. October 29th, 1969, began like any typical morning at Firebase Kate. The men cycled through their standard routines, checking weapons, scanning the tree line. Around midday, the first shells began falling. Initially, it seemed like harassment fire, the sort of thing they'd managed before. But then more rounds arrived, and they didn't stop. Within an hour, it became clear this wasn't a probe or a warning. This was the beginning of something catastrophic. The artillery barrage proved intense and expertly coordinated. Mortars and rockets hammered the Firebase from multiple directions simultaneously. The North Vietnamese gunners had obviously mapped every bunker and defensive position on the base. Explosions tore through the wire, throwing up massive clouds of red dust. Albra moved between positions, checking on his men, directing return fire. Even so, there wasn't much they could accomplish except take cover and wait for the shelling to subside. Then the ground assault commenced. North Vietnamese Army infantry began advancing toward the perimeter in disciplined waves, moving through the jungle with precision and coordination. The defenders opened fire with machine guns and rifles, attempting to repel them. The Montagnard fighters, intimately familiar with the terrain, fought ferociously alongside the Americans. More enemy troops kept emerging from the hills. It became rapidly obvious this wasn't a small unit engagement. This was a full-scale assault by a massive force. By nightfall, the Firebase was completely encircled. The attackers had established positions around the entire perimeter, close enough that the defenders could hear them conversing and shifting equipment. Albra attempted to call for air support, but the weather had deteriorated badly, Ammunition became a critical concern by midday. The men were rationing rounds carefully, firing only when they had confirmed targets rather than laying down suppressive fire. Albra transmitted word to headquarters, requesting an emergency resupply drop, but the weather refused to cooperate. Low clouds and fog had settled over the highlands, making it impossible for aircraft to reach them safely. Meanwhile, the enemy maintained steady pressure from the surrounding hills. Every bullet counted now, and everyone understood it. That afternoon, Albra attempted to call in air support to strike the North Vietnamese Army positions in the tree line. He could hear the pilots circling above the cloud cover, but they couldn't see the ground well enough to drop ordnance without risking hitting the firebase itself. After several failed attempts, the aircraft had to turn back. It was frustrating, but there was little anyone could do about the weather. The men on the ground would have to hold on their own for now. By the second night, exhaustion was taking its toll. The soldiers had been fighting continuously for more than 24 hours, and sleep wasn't possible with the constant threat of another ground assault. Albra rotated his men as best he could, giving small groups brief breaks to rest and consume whatever rations remained. The Montagnards chewed betel nut to stay alert, while the Americans drank instant coffee mixed with cold canteen water. Everyone was running on pure adrenaline and willpower at this point. Despite everything, morale held surprisingly well. Albra made it a priority to visit each position personally, offering encouragement, ensuring no one felt abandoned in the fight. He didn't sugarcoat their situation, but he remained calm and steady, which helped the others maintain their composure. Albra understood what that signified. Higher command had either written them off or lacked the resources to reach them. Either way, it didn't alter the fact that Firebase Kate was surrounded by thousands of enemy troops with orders to overrun it. Remaining in place wasn't a strategy anymore. It was simply waiting to die. That night, Albra sat in the command bunker and began considering options that hadn't existed 24 hours earlier. He wasn't prepared to surrender the firebase without cause, but he also refused to sacrifice his men for a lost cause. At some point, the mathematics would force a decision: stay and fight to the end, or risk everything on a breakout attempt. For now, he kept that thought private. But deep down, he recognized the clock was running out. By the morning of the third day, Albra knew they couldn't hold out any longer. The ammunition was nearly depleted. The wounded were accumulating, and the radio kept delivering the same message: no air support, no reinforcements. Meanwhile, enemy fire hadn't diminished at all. They remained completely surrounded, and every passing hour worsened their situation. Albra gathered his senior leaders and presented the reality. Staying at Firebase. Kate meant they'd all be killed or captured within the next day or two. The choice confronting them wasn't simple. Abandoning a firebase contradicted everything they'd been trained to believe. That ground was supposed to be defended regardless of cost. However, Albra saw it with absolute clarity. There was no honor in dying for a position no one was coming to save. His responsibility was keeping his men alive, and remaining in place would only guarantee the opposite. After approximately an hour, they passed through the first enemy position. Albra could hear voices nearby. North Vietnamese Army soldiers conversing quietly, probably waiting for dawn to launch another attack on the firebase. He froze, signaling the men behind him to halt. They remained completely motionless for what felt like an eternity. barely breathing. Then, when the voices moved away, Albra waved them forward. They slipped past undetected. It was the first moment anyone allowed themselves to believe the escape might actually succeed. Halfway to the landing zone, one of the men stumbled and fell hard. The sound echoed through the trees like a gunshot. Everyone dropped to the ground instantly, weapons ready, hearts pounding. They waited in absolute silence, listening for shouts or gunfire. Nothing came. The jungle remained quiet. Albra helped the man up, checked him for injuries, and kept moving. Every delay represented risk, but he refused to leave anyone behind. That was the principle he'd established from the beginning, and he adhered to it, even now. By 3 a.m, they'd covered most of the distance. The jungle began to thin out, and Albra could see open ground ahead. The landing zone where helicopters were supposed to meet them at first light. He transmitted a radio message on a backup frequency, hoping someone was monitoring. A few minutes later, a voice crackled back, confirming pickup at dawn. Relief washed over the group, but they weren't safe yet. They still had to hold the landing zone until the helicopters arrived, and North Vietnamese Army patrols were everywhere. The men spread out in a defensive perimeter around the clearing and waited. It was the longest few hours of their lives. Every sound in the jungle felt like an approaching enemy force. Albra remained in the center, checking each position, keeping everyone calm and focused. He didn't display fear or doubt, even though he understood how close they'd come to being completely wiped out. When the sky finally began to lighten, and they heard the distant rhythmic thump of rotor blades, it felt surreal, almost dreamlike. They'd survived the night. For years afterward, almost no one outside the men who were there knew the complete story. There were no medal ceremonies, no front-page headlines, and no official recognition of what Albra had accomplished. Part of that was timing. By late 1969, the war had become deeply unpopular back home, and stories of American heroism didn't generate much attention anymore. But it was also the nature of the engagement itself. Firebase Kate wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. It was survival, and survival didn't always make compelling press. Albra himself rarely discussed it. He returned home, left the army, and attempted to move forward with his life, like so many veterans did. The memories persisted, though. The sounds of the siege, the faces of the men he'd led, the weight of every decision he'd made in the darkness. For decades, Firebase Kate existed only in his mind, and in the quiet conversations he'd occasionally have with the handful of men who'd been there with him. It wasn't something he felt compelled to relive publicly. That began to change in the early 2000s when author Marvin Wolf heard about the story and reached out to Albra. Initially, Albra was reluctant. He didn't see himself as a hero, just a young officer who'd done what he had to do. But Wolf persisted, interviewing survivors and methodically piecing together what had really transpired on that firebase. The result was the book Abandoned in Hell, published in 2015. In the end, Firebase Kate became more than just a battle. It became a reminder that courage doesn't always arrive with recognition, and that some of the most remarkable acts in war occur far from the spotlight. Albra's leadership that October saved lives, and his story, once lost to time, now stands as a testament to what people can endure when they refuse to surrender. It wasn't the kind of heroism that demanded attention. It was the quiet, determined kind that simply got the job done when everything seemed impossible.